Hello, we're going to look today at these student loans company terms and conditions. So this has been a real hot topic recently, so I'm going to go into it and do a bit of a deep dive and see if we can deconstruct it a little bit. So what we see all the time, news articles, comments on social media, is a load of claims about the student loans companies, terms and conditions, or the terms of these loans, and a lot of people complaining. So what do people say? So what we hear is the terms of the loans have changed. The threshold was supposed to go up with some kind of measure, usually to do with earnings or sometimes to do with inflation, but um, that's not what's clear. And the other claim, they didn't tell me that the interest rates will change. I also see I've been charged 9%, sometimes 15% interest. See that one quite a lot. They told me the loans were interest free. You see that particularly with Plan 1 loans, and what we're going to do today, we'll look at mainly Plan 2 loans, which I think people tend not to say that about Plan 2 loans. This is a common one. I was told the bank wouldn't ask about my student loan when I applied for a mortgage. Yeah, that one a lot. They told me the repayments would cost the same as a cup of coffee or a mobile phone contract. That one's come up a lot, and there's been much discussion about that, including the parliamentary reports that um, recently been published mentions this. So we'll look at that a little bit. We also see this student loans have been privatized. Private companies have put up the interest rates. Someone is making lots of profits about loans. And we'll probably come to those latter ones about the privatization of profit making in the future. But that's some things that people say. Okay, so we're going to look at the terms. This document here, which is available online, goes back a few years, but it's useful to look at that because people say about the terms changing. So it's useful to go back a few years. This is 2018-19. This document from Student Finance England, which will be the vast majority of Plan 2 borrowers would be people using Student Finance England. We're not going to cover Northern Ireland, Wales, or Scotland in this video for Student Finance England. This document from Student Finance England covers plans 1, 2, and 3, 3 being the postgraduate loans, and plan 1 being the loans that were available before 2012. We are going to focus on plan 2 loans today, even though this guide covers plans 1, 2, and 3. So this document is a sort of expanded guide of the terms. It has all the terms in it, but there's a little bit of explanation in them as well. So when students apply for a student loan, most people will do that online. And during that online process, students are asked to accept terms and conditions, like you are with lots of things. If you sign up for a mobile phone contract, it's possibly a bad example with this one, but sign up for a mobile phone contract or your broadband provider, any of those type of things, you change your gas, utility, electricity, you sign up for the terms and conditions. If you get any other type of loan, mortgage, there will be terms and conditions. This is very common. So this is a detailed outline of how your loan will be managed by the student loans company and what you're expected to do as a borrower. Anything else that you've heard from your head of sixth form, or a careers advisor, from University Open Day, or a friend, or a parent, or a teacher, or anything like that, is going to be an interpretation of the terms. It's going to be, oh yes, that won't cost you very much because that's an interpretation of the terms. The terms themselves, what we're going to look at here. What does the terms that people signed up to when they took out one of these loans, what do they actually say? Because you're not taking out a loan from your school or your college or your teacher or anything like that. You're taking out a student loans company loan from essentially from the government. So this guide covers the plans 1, 2, and 3, and it's from 2018-19. So it's a few years after plan 2 was launched, sort of about halfway through it, really, because plan 2 was in place from 2012 to 2023. So it's kind of it's kind of middle. Um, so let's do a deep dive into the terms and conditions. Well, maybe not, because that might be kind of a little bit boring. Let's look at the terms that people may have missed. So what follows here is some screenshots from that document. So it explains what the guide's about, says who it's for, explains that we're looking at undergraduate, postgraduate, and loans for initial teacher training, which I think is PGCEs, people taking people trained to be teachers. Some housekeeping stuff about phone numbers and websites, and mentions the various bodies involved, like the Student Loans Company, the Student Finance England, the Department of Education, that kind of thing. So this is very standard stuff, nothing too interesting at this stage. Have a look here. The regulations may change from time to time, and this means the terms of the loan may also change. This is a really funny one because people often complain that the terms have changed. They have actually said that they will change. And the bizarre thing about this is that people complain that they've changed. The examples they give aren't usually changes. They're things that you could have predicted from the terms. And there's only one example of a term that has changed. And it isn't one you think. We'll come to that later. So, who does what? So this is the who, why, and the where. Student Loans Company are responsible for paying out the loans. You can see this is pre-Brexit, so this is when EU students could apply for loans. Student Loans Company are responsible for paying out the loans. They also manage the loan account. They add the interest and they refund overpayments, and they deal with repayments from overseas repayers. Now, that doesn't just mean EU students. That could be home students who move abroad after they've graduated. And they'll answer questions about your student loan. So far, so good. The HMRC, well, what have they got to do with it? Well, they collect the repayments through the tax system. So the decision was made, instead of people, say, writing a check or doing a bank transfer to the Student Loans Company every year with how much they owe, how much they should pay, like paying a bill, it would just be collected out of people's pay as you earn. So it became it's like a graduate tax, effectively. If you've taken out one of these loans and you have to make a repayment, they'll take it from your wages before you even see the money. And obviously your employer is therefore impacted because they deal with your salary, and they'll stop that loan repayment before they credit you with your net wages. And it also says up here about HMRC sharing information with the Student Loans Company. Qualifies it slightly. It says that HMRC doesn't give Student Loans Company any information about tax. And I think HMRC doesn't tell the Student Loans Company doesn't tell HMRC how much you owe either. It's just the fact you have a loan and you have an outstanding balance, and therefore stoppage needs to be made above the threshold. So that's who does what. And then it moves on to what you have to do. And this is interesting. I think this is the first sign of this being a little bit of a one-sided document, or not so much one-sided, but the fact that the odds are stacked against students and graduates slightly, in that there's a lot more that's in this big list of things that you're responsible for doing. What they seem to be doing looks light touch, but what you seem to be doing is perhaps a greater list. But some of it's not really anything to be too concerned about. So, for example, you have to tell there's quite a big section here about what you have to tell the SLC about, like changes of name, change your university, change your course, you finish your course, all that kind of thing. So kind of housekeeping, really. And although it looks like a long list, nothing really to be too upset about, perhaps, but that's the list in there. And it mentions here, this is the first mention here of your interest rate of RPI plus 3% for the Plan 2 loan. And that's going to be qualified later on page 7. And what this is there's a kind of sanction here. If you don't keep in touch with us, or you fail to advise us of changes, we'll charge you the RPI plus 3% as the full rate of that they can collect against you if you as a sign of sanction for not keeping in touch and giving them the information that they need to collect the repayments. So mentioned here is the penalty charge. So this is one that you hardly ever hear anyone talk of. One of the sanctions is that they can ask you, and I guess this would be in very extreme circumstances, they can ask you to repay the entire lump sum of all the money you owe them, including the interest, if they feel that you're not keeping up with your terms, if you're not paying it back, or completing your tax returns if you're self-employed, or if you've moved overseas and you're not keeping in touch with them. The ultimate sanction is they can say to you, right, you owe us £50,000 or £60,000. we'd like all of that now in one go. I've never heard of that happen, but it is in the terms, and that's what everybody has agreed to. And I've mentioned the sanction here. Okay, and this final bit here is interesting as well, because you sometimes, I haven't put this in my list of claims, but sometimes see people say, how can someone who's 17 sign up to one of these loans when they're still a child, or they're still at school, they're still a school pupil, that kind of thing. And I mentions this here, that if you take out the loan agreement before you're 18, then there's a process for ratifying it. I guess they get back in touch with you after your 18th birthday and ask you to reconfirm the terms and conditions. Now, the likelihood is you're still going to be at university at this point. It's not likely that you've finished and graduated. Absolutely not, because most of the courses are at least 3 years old. So people who apply for a student loan, perhaps if their birthday is late in the academic year and they apply for it when they're 17, sounds like the student loans company will get in touch with you and say, could you ratify this, and you re-sign up to the terms and conditions once you turned 18. So that covers that kind of legal aspect, I guess, of the how can people who are 17 make such a big commitment to these loans? They have that covered here. Okay, so there's different payment plans covered here: repayment plan 1 and 2, and then they talk about postgraduate loan, which is sometimes referred to as repayment plan 3. I'm going to focus mainly here on the plan 2, though, which is those loans that came out on the 1st of September 2012, which coincides with the fees going up to £9,000. So this is the detail on there. It's a big chunk of information about repayment plan 2, and it talks about repaying the loan once you have your income has exceeded the threshold the April after you finish your studies. So this is likely to be 3.5 years after you start. So you've paid up to 3.5 years interest on some element of your loan by this point. And I'll qualify that you haven't paid it, you've had it added to your balance. And then you'll start making payments once you're over the threshold and after April the 6th, that's after that tax year. So you could graduate in June, July, start work straight away and work for a few months up until April without having to pay anything, just not expected to pay anything until after that tax year. And that's because they want to look at your tax return and work out how much you've been earning so they can set what your repayment should be for the following year. Now, I've highlighted in this page all the references to threshold, because one of those claims is that the threshold hasn't changed as it ought to. They mention threshold many, many times. I think it's mentioned over 30 times in the document, that it always is in relation to you earning over the threshold or what the threshold is. And there's a little bit in here about the threshold currently being 21,000 as it was when this document was published in 2017. And subject to parliamentary approval, this would change to 25,000. So that's historically the biggest change in the threshold that's ever happened. It moved up £4,000. And that did happen, that went ahead and that was approved and the threshold was increased. It doesn't mention anything about the threshold being increased for postgraduate loans. And for payment 1, it says the threshold will be uprated in future years. Very vague though, and this is all extremely vague. When they talk about threshold increases, the threshold will be uprated in future years. It doesn't say every year, it doesn't say how often. And on plan 2, it looks like it needs to go through parliamentary approval to have that update. And that update was the first one for quite a long time, I believe. And then there were other periods of time where it wasn't updated as well. So threshold is mentioned lots in the document. However, at no point in the document could I find anything that said anything about how frequently the threshold would be reviewed or any mechanism for increasing it. Something like it will be kept in line with average earnings or average graduate earnings, or the threshold will increase in line with inflation or RPI or CPI. Mentions nothing like that at all. There is nothing in the terms and conditions that indicates the threshold will increase, regardless of what politicians may have promised or what various talks may have said, such as the threshold may be reviewed or will be reviewed. That in itself is not concrete enough as a mechanism to increase it by a certain amount by some measure. Nothing in terms and conditions mentions that. So on to repayment plan and how much you'll repay. So it shows here for your income, and this is subject to the expected change, the 25,000. See, anticipating it's going to change to 25,000. At 25,000, you're actually on the threshold. Your payment zero. It's only when you go to 25,000 at £1 that you would ever be paying anything. So zero at 25,000 for Plan 2 graduates. And then it shows another 4 stages of income at 27, 29, 31, and 33. So 2,000 intervals with additional payments. You can see by increasing your income by from the 27 just by £6,000, it quadruples the amount that you're paying back. So this is kind of the first hint that the more you earn, those repayments are going to be a lot higher. They're going to go up exponentially as you rise. And that's to do with the fact that that threshold is fairly high. But when you do start earning above it, because it's 9% of your income, that amount collected at the above threshold amount is going to go up significantly for people earning more money. A little bit about extra payments. You can make voluntary payments. Voluntary mentioned a couple of times there, so it is absolutely voluntary. There's no expectation that you pay extra money, but it does warn you that if you make a voluntary payment, you cannot get that back. So it kind of puts people off making voluntary payments, and lots of parents talk about overpaying and trying to get their sons and daughters to pay it off quicker so they don't have to pay the interest. It's kind of not really the point of these loans. The idea is you just pay what you're expected to pay, not anymore. And to overpay it, especially early on in your 30-year term, could be quite foolish because you overpay it, you'll still have to pay the same amount each month. It's not like any other type of loan where you've cleared a bit of your balance and your repayment might go down. It's going to be exactly the same if you don't clear the balance. So overpaying comes with some risk, and I've highlighted that comment here. That's actually in bold as well. That's their bold, not mine, and then I've highlighted it. So they're bringing our attention to the fact that overpaying is probably not a good idea. So how much interest do you charge? There's a whole section on interest. This is for Plan 2. There was information on Plan 1, and the postgraduate ones. I've concentrated on Plan 2. Interest here. So whilst you're studying, this is the bit that catches some people out. It's in the terms. Whilst you're studying, up until that April, so that could be 3.5 years or 4.5 years if you do an integrated master's, it's RPI plus 3%. And it explains here that RPI is a measure of UK inflation, retail price index, the cost of things in the shops, basically. Then you've got this period of time after the April, after you finish your course, which is then income contingent. The interest rate varies based on your income. So if you earn less than 21,000, and they've kept the 21,000 in here, which is bizarre because they're talking about moving the threshold to 25,000. So I think that's possibly a mistake in this guide because they ought to have put the 25,000 in and then had a little comment like they did on the previous page. But anyway, as it is, 21,000 or less is RPI. So you just pay the retail price index as whatever the percentage retail price index, they use that percentage to increase your balance for any money that you haven't repaid. And then there's a sliding scale, which they're very vague about, but between 21 and 41,000, the RPI plus up to 3%. So it's always going to be at least RPI. And then the percentage they add onto that is on a sliding scale, depending on what your income is. What it doesn't qualify is what the steps are, what stages are, how does it go from 1 to 2 to 3%. Doesn't say that. And I've never seen that anywhere either. And there must be some detail of it somewhere so they can do the calculation, but I've never seen that in their documents. But anyway, between that range, when you're going from threshold to essentially there or thereabouts, a higher rate taxpayer, it's on a sliding scale. When you hit the 41,000, there's another threshold, which it doesn't get talked about a lot. There's another threshold where your interest that's added is the RPI plus 3%. the same as it was when you were studying. And that's the bit that has probably been the most controversial thing about Plan 2 loans because of the plus 3%. It's not just keeping up with inflation, they're adding something else on top of that as well. Lots of people probably understood why they needed to keep up with inflation so that the loan balances weren't eroded and became worthless. But the 3% does seem to be probably the most, like I say, most controversial part. Then the final bit, another sanction. If you don't keep in touch with us, and they've mentioned this already this is just a repetition of what they've mentioned earlier, but if you don't keep up with us and you don't advise us of any changes, they don't hear from you for a year, they will add the full amount of RPI plus 3%. So if you're on a low income, but you don't get in touch with them, your loan balance will start increasing much more than it would have done if you'd kept in touch with them, told them what your low income was, or if you were traveling or something. Okay, this is about the cancellation of the loans at the end of the term. So, for Plan 2, I think this is quite well known. Plan 2s are cancelled at the end of the 30-year term, and it mentions how you never have to pay it back, and they cancel any interest or outstanding loan balance. It's not just the loan that gets cancelled, or that interest that was added is also cancelled. So to someone who's always earned below the threshold and never paid anything back, their balance will have increased an awful lot because it would just continue to be adding compound interest each year. And that means that interest is charged on the interest from last year as well. But after the 30 years, it would be written off. And they also say there's some other reasons why they might cancel your loan as well if you become disabled and unfit for work, and also if you die. Obviously, no one who dies probably thinks about this too much, but the main thing there is it's not passed on to your estate. So your friend, your family, your relatives, the people who inherit your house if you own one, the next of kin are not liable for your student loan after your death. I think that's sort of important reassurance for parents and children of graduates. Okay, so there's some more stuff about what happens if you don't make repayments. There is some information about ending your loan. So this is essentially what you're supposed to do if you're nearing the end of your loan. What they recommend is in the last 4 to 23 months, you switch to direct debit. And the main reason for that is just so that if you are about to pay off your loan through pay-as-you-earn payments, because the pay-as-you-earn calculation is only done once a year, is to prevent you from, say, paying off the loan in May or June one year, and then having another 10 or 11 payments until the next end of tax year where you're making a payment for something that you've cleared. Now, it does say they'll pay that back if you haven't done that, and they'll pay you back with interest as well. So they pay you back interest on your overpayment, but essentially they're hoping that you won't get into that situation. And very few people, if almost no one, will have got to this stage yet through natural payments of repaying the loan through just their income repayments. But some people may have done that if they've made large voluntary overpayments. But most people who've taken out the loan and are working through the 30-year term on a Plan 2 loan that first came out in 2012, so they would have graduated in 2015 or 2016. They probably won't have got to this stage yet. So this is future proofing. Okay, we're going to look at these University Open Day talks. This comes up quite a lot because a lot of people have learned all about the student loans at a University Open Day talk or a university visit, something similar to that. And a lot of people's information about what are in those terms and conditions is actually not first-hand from reading the terms and conditions. It's from what they were told, like I said earlier, the interpretation by a university or college. So most universities will have a talk on student finance at their open days. Many people have been to these, and that includes information about tuition fees, accommodation, bursaries, and scholarships. So typically what happens is a university will have a member of staff who talks to a group of students and their parents, prospective students and their parents, tells them how much it's going to cost to go to university, the fees, the likely accommodation costs for their city, or their own halls of residence if they have them. Then, as well as that, they tell them what money the university might be able to give them in terms of bursaries and scholarships for some students who might be eligible for it, depend on the criteria. And then they'll talk about the student loans that come from the student loans company. So it's all bound up together. So what I found, and I must say before I go into any detail on this information on the internet, if you do a Google search for student finance presentation, the presentation that I found comes up on the second or third hit. It's a presentation by the University of Nottingham. It's very typical of presentations made by universities about student finance. There's no date on the document, but all the information is consistent with it being written about the Plan 2 loans. I do not work for the University of Nottingham. I've no affiliation with them. Their information is just found online, but it represents a typical university presentation. If you've been to one of these, you'll recognise a lot of this. If you haven't, then this is what you can find out what people are told at those talks. So there's about 30 slides in the whole presentation, and I'm showing about 4 or 5 of them here. So it talks about the loan repayments. So just dive straight into the repayments. Skip a lot of the other stuff about how much the fees are and things like that, because that's fairly standard. So if you've taken out a tuition fee loan to help with your living cost, then you need to pay this back. How does this work? It mentions the threshold. Now, in this presentation, the threshold is still the 21,000, which obviously was in a transitional phase in the other document. So only when you're earning above 21,000 and the April after you graduate. So again, that's consistent with those terms. And then until you're earning this amount, you will not pay anything back. So there's a couple of case studies in there, and I'm jumping to case study 2 because case study 1, the example, the graduate earned under the threshold and didn't pay anything. So there's a little bit of a case study here. A lot of this is irrelevant, really, what type of job they've got. It says they're working at Boots. Well, Boots is a big company based in Nottingham, so it's probably why they've chosen Boots, but it's completely irrelevant. You can be working for anyone. Salary is the important bit. So she starts, Joe in the case study here starts after May, in the May after she graduated, so that's obviously relevant because the loans kick in from April, and she's earning a salary of 25,000. She's worried how much she's going to have to pay back. How much should she have to pay back? So they're posing a question, and it's actually multiple choice questions. I guess when they did the presentation, they put these up, and you had to guess. You have to guess what it might be, and they tell you. So how much will Joe have to pay? And here you go. Here's all the examples. Now in the presentation, they don't give you the answer. There's no animation on it. It's from the document that's left online. I guess it was a PowerPoint. Something came up or they said it. I don't know. So there's 4 answers of how much she has to pay. Now remember, she's earning 25,000 and the threshold is 21,000. So it's 4,000 above the threshold. So quick mental maths. 4,000, 9% of 4,000 divided by 12. So it's basically 9% of 4,000 is 36. 360 divided by 12 is going to be £30 a month. Just a mental math on 4,000 divided times 9% divided by 12. It's going to be £30 a month. So they've given these different examples: £30, £5, 60, 150. No, the answer is A, and I've put this circle on it. But what's funny here, and this has come up a lot, is they've said about the same price as a mobile phone contract. Now, not having a pop at the University of Nottingham here because there's a lot of information that floated out about here, and I suppose they were trying to be relatable. And to be fair to them, they do give then other related costs for £5 as a cinema ticket, £60 as a gym membership, and 150 is the same as installments on a car. The reason I find these problematic, of course, is that they're all things that are extremely variable. So the students go away thinking, oh, it's £30, the same as a mobile phone contract. Well, that's only contingent on these very specific circumstances of the threshold being 21 and the salary being 25. I fear that some people walked away from that thinking those only be about the same as a mobile phone contract. It's also a very variable amount, isn't it? Some mobile phone contracts are more than others. The credit installments for a new car, well, what's your new car? If you buy a car that's £10,000, the payments on that going to be less than if you buy a car that's £50,000. So maybe a little bit unhelpful, especially if, and maybe this is possibly with the benefit of hindsight, but it's maybe a little bit unhelpful if all that people walked away from that was, oh, it's about the same as a mobile phone contract, and it will always forevermore be about the same as a phone contract. That's not necessarily that helpful. I think just giving you the number was enough. So loan repayments, which goes into what I was saying, is 9% of 21,000. Sorry, 9% of any income over 21,000. They have said it's like a graduate tax, kind of fairly brave of them there. Deducted from the pay packet. That graduate tax thing was actually something the government were keen to avoid labelling as. I think a lot of people understand that's really kind of what it is. If you've taken out one of these loans, you're going to be hit with a graduate tax. The only way it isn't a graduate tax is that students who paid or student whose parents paid the fees for them never got hit with it. But it's a graduate tax for those that took the loan. Okay, so what they've done here, and I quite like this for two reasons. This table doesn't have some kind of comparisons with, oh, it's about the same price as an ice cream or a cup of coffee or something else, stuff like that. It's just got the numbers. And the other thing they've done is they've gone up to a much higher salary than the student loans company do in their terms and conditions. They've gone up to 60,000, which for a 17-year-old at an open day will be an amount of money that I think is way more than they'll ever earn, or they're not like to earn that for a very, very long time. But it is good that they've gone up a bit further, because some of the less helpful presentations just show 20, 25, and 30, and they keep those amounts low so that it always looks cheap. And then possibly quite a lot of people would have not really considered, oh, what if I earn 60 or 100,000 or something like that. So they're showing the payments going up by a greater, because of the way that threshold works, they're going up by a much greater percentage in terms of the proportion that you're paying than the salary itself is increasing. So for example, if you take some easy maths here, 30,000 to 60,000, your salary doubles, your gross salary, but your payment goes from 67.50 to 292, which is nearly 4 or 5 times as much as the original amount. It's a significant increase. So fair play to University of Nottingham for doing this and showing that it could increase an awful lot. And I did a little bit of an additional calculation on this. If the salary had been 121,000, so you're earning 100,000 above the threshold, the amount of salary that the 9% deducted is therefore going to be 9% of 100,000. 9% of 100,000 is there 9,000 there. 9,000 a year and 750 a month. So 121. Now, a lot of people thinking, well, students don't earn 121,000, but some will. Some will go into professions well at some point. In the 30 years, remember, it's a 30-year term, you're going to earn 121,000. So at that level, 121,000, which they don't show, is a bit more extreme than what they're showing. You're paying 750 a month. And no one then can say that's a bit like a mobile phone contract. You're paying 750 a month at that quite high salary. You're spending the amount of money that would cover a repayment on a luxury car, not a mobile phone contract, a luxury car. A high-end car is going to cost you 750 a month or so in the repayment loan. So that's the kind of regions it can get into if you earn a bit more. So fair play to Nottingham for taking this beyond the 30, 35, whatever. I think the student loans company got to 33. Fair play to them for taking it up a bit higher and showing that they can increase quite significantly as income goes up. So interest. Now this is a big bone of contention. So what do Nottingham say to that? What did Nottingham say to their potential students, their prospective students back 10 years or so ago? So they essentially portrayed the same information. When you're studying, it's the rate of inflation. They don't use RPI, they just call it the rate of inflation plus 3%. Then after you're liable to repay and have an income of 21,000, it drops to just the rate of inflation, no plus 3%. And then they go into this thing again where it's 21 to 41,000, which is why we know this is pre-2017, because it talks about the 21,000 threshold here. And then it then talks about this varying rate of inflation depending on your income. Again, not going into any detail on it. That's very rare to see. I've never seen it. Never seen the explainer as to how the interest goes from the just RPI to RPI plus 3 over this band of 21,000 to 41. How does it increase? I don't know how they do that. And then finally, if your income's over 41,000, you have the rate of inflation plus 3%. So I think a fair play again to Nottingham here. They've called it the rate of inflation, haven't used the RPI term, and they've laid it all out. That's how much interest you're going to pay. What none of these documents do, the Nottingham presentation or the Student Loans Company, neither of them mention that rate of inflation, that RPI, will change every year. And every year they'll change the interest amount that you're adding on your loan, not just based on your income on these calculations, but on the fact that RPI changes. Now, whoever wrote this probably thought that was obvious, but is it obvious to a 17-year-old that the Student Loans Company each year is going to go, okay, what was the RPI last year? Oh, it's gone up to 6%. Right, now that it's gone up to 6%, that's 6 plus 3. We'll charge this new rate. It isn't actually explicitly called out in the document that every year they'll make that change. They'll make that calculation. Okay, so let's go back to these popular claims. So the terms of the loans have changed retrospectively. The threshold was supposed to go up with a certain measure. They didn't tell me the interest rates would change. Okay, so how do these stand up to scrutiny? I'm being charged 9%, 15% interest. They told me the loans were interest free. I was told the bank wouldn't ask about the student loan. They told me the repayments would cost the same as a mobile phone contract or a cup of coffee. Student loans have been privatized. Private companies have put up the interest rate. Someone's making lots of profit. So these are the popular claims that we hear. So the terms have changed retrospectively. Well, I'd say busted. I think that doesn't hold up. One, because they haven't changed terms retrospectively, with one exception that's fairly recent, where they put a cap on the interest rates. They've capped them so they don't go up above a certain amount. I think it's about 6%. That's actually a benefit to students and graduates because they're charging them less. So that's the only retrospective change. The other claims that they've changed the terms retrospectively really don't hold up. There are no terms that have been changed retrospectively because they're already all in there, all the things that people thought would happen. It mentions that right from the outset. It said that they would vary the interest depending on your income. It said that it would be RPI plus 3% for the time that you're studying. You might not like it, but it always said that. The other very bizarre thing about this is the actual terms say that they might change the terms. There's a statement in the terms that say they might change. So it's a very strange one, this. They haven't really changed them. But if they wanted to, they could, because they have always said that they would potentially be varying the terms. Now, I think that's very odd that you are asking people to sign something to say that they might change, and then they'll let you know what the changes are. But with the exception of the cap, which is a benefit to graduates, they haven't done any changes. And most of the claims of the changes, most of the claims that changes have been made don't really hold up because they were in there all along. So the threshold was supposed to go up with insert a certain measure. Well, again, terms do not state that. You might have heard someone at an open day saying that they were going to adjust the threshold every year and it would go up with earnings and things like that. But you're not getting a loan from the university. And that person saying that, you shouldn't have said it. It's not in the terms. Read the small print. It's not in the terms. They never said it. It's never promised. They mentioned threshold 33 times, and at no point does it say that there's any measure or calculation about how they'll adjust it. It even indicates that it has to go through Parliament for them to change the threshold, and that it will be changed periodically, but there's no promise that it'll go up by a certain measure. That's that was never ever in the terms. And then the other one here, they didn't tell me that the interest rates would change. Well, I say that's half true. They did say they'd change according to your income. And according to the time, because if you're studying, you get charged the RPI plus 3, and then after you graduate and after the April the 6th, it could drop. But what they ought to have said is that RPI rate is reviewed annually, and it doesn't call that out. Now, probably a lot of parents would realise that that's going to change over 30 years. If you think about it, is inflation the same over 30 years? No, of course it isn't. It goes up and down. So the fact that we kind of older people in the room would understand that goes up and down. The people that wrote the documents, if when they said that it was RPI, they knew that that was implied that it was going to go up and down. But I think they really should have called it out and said RPI will be set at the rate every September or whatever it is that they do it on. And it does say that on the student loans company website. It does give you the information about how they set the interest each year, but it doesn't call that out. So I'd say that's half true, only half true though. Okay, so this interest rate charge of 9% and 15%, this is when people get confused between the 9% repayment amount, the 9% above threshold of your salary, and they think that's the interest. It isn't the interest. It's absolutely not all percentages are interest. If I've got 2 apples and I eat one, I've got 50% of the apples. It doesn't mean I've charged interest. It just means I've ate an apple. This is the same. Not all percentages are interest. So if you've been charged 9% of your above threshold salary, then that's not interest. That's just your repayment. That's how they've calculated your repayment. The other one, 15%, where does that come from? Interest has never been 15%. Even when it hit its peak, they never charge 15%. Well, 15% is someone with a postgraduate loan. So they've got 9% on their undergraduate loan. They've got 6% for their postgraduate. They're above threshold for both. They'll have 15% collected, not interest. So that's untrue. They told me that the loans were interest free. Well, they never did. Some of the plan one, they fudged it a bit and said that it was going to be kept up with inflation RPI, but even then it had a link to the Bank of England base rate. There was a strange calculation where they would charge the lower of 2 amounts, whether that was the Bank of England base plus 1, I think, or RPI. And then when you get into plan 2 and they're talking about up to RPI plus 3%, it's always very clear that there would be an adjustment. Whether you call it interest or not, it kind of walks like a duck, quacks like a duck. It is interest, isn't it? I was told that the bank wouldn't ask about student loans when I apply for a mortgage. We hear this a lot, hear this an awful lot. And the money saving expert talked about this a lot and said that, yeah, it wouldn't take out a student loan, it won't affect your credit rating. I could do a future video on that. I think that's a whole other kind of worms that we can look into in terms of what people said and what people heard. They told me that the repayments would cost the same as a cup of coffee or a mobile phone contract approved. I say yes, they did that. Universities did that, and I think some of the student loan company documentation, some of their guidance did that as well. I think that's unfortunate that that happened. It doesn't mean anything either. Like a mobile phone contract, when the iPhones came out 20 years ago, it was £60 a month. I'm paying £10 a month now for a SIM with unlimited calls. It doesn't mean anything. They shouldn't have done that. It's unhelpful because there's a variable rate as well based on your income. It wasn't always going to be a mobile. It was the same with your mobile phone contract. If you happen to have a salary just above the threshold, and that was coming up at £30 a month, and you happen to have a mobile phone contract that was £30 a month, which some do and some don't. Same as this whole cup of coffee, cinema ticket, all this kind of thing. Kind of unhelpful because it probably gave graduates the idea that it would always be that cheap. And as their income rised, it would always be that cheap. And in defense of the student loans company, their actual terms don't say that. Nowhere in the terms does it say, oh, it'll be this much because it'd be the same as your mobile phone contract or any other arbitrary measure. But that's clearly been told to a lot of people. And this final one about privatization and profits and things like that, again, one for a future video, because it's generally not true, but there's a lot of reason why people think that and why that why that sort of myth, if you like, has got legs and has run away with itself. So we'll do a future video on that one. But thanks for listening.
Numbers 3 through 17.